Yo, what's up YouTube? It's the one and only Legend of Winning, aka Low, and I'm back again with another video. Now before we get into this video, let me set something up for you. Let me set the right scene and mood for you. So you're on Twitter, right? You're on Twitter, you're on Instagram, maybe even Facebook. You're scrolling down the timeline, going through the feed. You see a couple pictures from Keke Palmer, you double click them and you like them. You see a couple pictures from Rihanna, you like them. Then you go on my Twitter page, you follow me on Twitter first if you haven't done it already, and then you add me, tell me how much you love my videos, and then bam, it hits you. Every time I'm on Twitter, I always see posts have these teams, these great teams, these phenomenal teams of some of the greatest basketball players of all time, and the post basically tells me pick one. They'll have team A, B, or C. Who do you think will win? And each team represents a certain generation, a decade of great players, and it normally gets me. It always gets to me, and I try to figure out who do I believe is going to win. A lot of times I delve a tad bit too much into it, but that's basically the premise of this video right here. Now before I get into the video real quick, let me make a few things clear. First things first, the teams and the players that I've selected to put on these teams. First and foremost, we have 6 teams. The first team is the 50s and 60s team. I had to put both of those generations together in those decades because there just weren't enough players. Then you have the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and then you had the 2010, which is the quote-unquote new era, which is basically from 2010 up until where we're at right now. Steph Curry, James Harden, players like that. 2, the way that you are selected to be on these teams is very simple. Basically, you have to have played 7 years or more within the decade for you to have been selected within that team. So yes, there are some players that played in 2 decades, but no, you have to play 7 years, at least 7 years in 1 decade to be selected for the team. With that being said, also, there will be one person or one player representing one team. So there are some players that are transcending enough to where they played in both decades or 2 decades, and they're very dominant in both of those decades. But I'm deciding to basically make sure they only get represented in 1 decade. Now that's where a lot of people have arguments about my selection, but you know, it's my list. This is the open conversation. And also, if you feel like I'm wrong in my selection, or you feel like you want to voice your opinion, always in the comment section below, let me know what you feel about the video. Also, there is a poll going on. Not only the Scottie Pippen poll is still going on, but I'm about to take that down. But also there is a poll for this video right here. So if you feel like, again, like I said before, you feel like I'm wrong, you can go into the poll. You tell me who do you think will actually win out of these 6 teams, and who you think is the best team as well. But again, enjoy the video. The poll is in the description below if you want to go vote, and let's get into it. So right out the gate, I believe that the 70s, yes, the 70s is the weakest generation, the weakest decade, and would put together the weakest team if you compare them with other decades and other generations in the NBA. Now, of course, they have great players on their team. Every decade does, but players like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Julius Erving, Rick Barry, Artis Gilmore, just to name a few, were really dominant in their time in the NBA. So I don't want to take anything away from those players at all. But when it does come to what they actually accomplished when their time in the NBA, to be completely honest with people, it's just not that significant when you start to compare what they did to a lot of other teams in a lot of other decades. The biggest reason why I say this is because of the ABA and NBA merger that happened in the mid to late 70s. Now, for those who don't know, the ABA was a separate league that ended up merging in the mid 70s. The ABA was more entertaining, more fun to watch compared to the NBA. And even though it did bring in a lot more excitement to the NBA, such as the slam dunk contest, the 3-point contest, I mean, heck, even the 3-point line itself was introduced once the NBA and ABA merged, that doesn't really make up for the lack of skill that a lot of players had in the ABA. Also in the ABA, defense was really not a priority. Teams were averaging somewhere between 120 to 130 points a game. And once the actual NBA and ABA merged, a lot of talent such as Artis Gilmore, who was so dominant in the ABA that he was an MVP in his rookie year, started to immediately decline once the merger happened. And because of that, I do feel like the ABA and the NBA, it more so watered down the league than helped it. But again, there's a lot of great talent in the 70s, but when you talk about what actually happened in that point of time, I don't know. I really have to, sit back and really start to question how great some of those players are. But yes, I do believe the 70s would easily lose to almost any decade consistently when you start to look at some of these great teams. The next team up is this new era of basketball, the era from 2010 on forward. Now, I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, I already know, but there's a lot of reasoning behind this, and to be completely honest with you, it's kind of not fair, simply because these players haven't thoroughly developed yet. They're still in the NBA, their careers are still going on, they can still develop into more well-rounded players. But as I see it, in today's NBA, players are nowhere near as well-rounded as they probably should be, especially when you start to compare it to other great generations and decades. Now, I already know what a lot of people are going to sit here and say, that players in the 50s and 60s, there's no way that they will be able to keep up with the athleticism and the physicality as players are today. Even though I don't believe the physical part, but the athleticism, sure, you're completely right. But I can make an argument that skill-wise, that there's a lot of things that today's NBA players do that really do hold them back when you start to compare them to other great players. Defense is by far one of the biggest weaknesses when it comes to players in the NBA. Players like Stephen Curry, James Harden, Blake Griffin, and DeMarcus Cousins would be relied on a lot when it comes to playing time if they were ever to go up against other decades. And I don't really know who DeMarcus Cousins will be guarding, regardless of what era or decade we're talking about. Even players like Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell would have a field day on a player like DeMarcus Cousins, especially trying to keep up with how quickly they're able to move up and down the court. Also, same thing with Stephen Curry. I don't know who is he going to guard regardless of what era or decade it is. He might have a huge problem. Same thing about James Harden. Blake Griffin has trouble with posting up bigs in today's league, let alone other players in other generations. So it's a major problem with some of these players. But I do want to be clear, they're obviously getting better. They still need to develop, and they still have more time to do so compared to everybody else whose careers is basically already over. So let's please, hold what I said with a grain of salt. Next, we have the 50s and 60s. Now, a lot of people would already claim that this team or this decade or this era would come last. It doesn't matter, regardless of how weak talents were in certain decades and era, it would simply become last because how prehistoric the skills were back in those days. Players really weren't as fast as they are now, or they'll claim that their dribbling or their skills weren't up to date. And players like Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain, Oscar Robertson had huge athletic advantages that ended up putting them over the top. A lot of that could be debatable, but I feel like players like Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, staying in the game for 40 plus minutes, regardless of what era you played in, you can't hold them back against that. Also, there are plenty of screenshots and video footage of those players doing things that even players today couldn't do. So I don't really understand why people consistently hold them back for their accomplishments and what they did in the NBA, because it's obvious that they're still phenomenal and great players. And the reason why I put this team over the 2010 team is simply because of a player like Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Jerry Lucas, Bob Pettit, how dominant they were with the time in the NBA. Regardless of how you want to talk about the talent level back then, I mean, Jesus Christ, 100 points Wilt Chamberlain put up, averaging 50 points a game. That's impressive regardless of what era that you're talking about. But they probably would have a huge disadvantage when it comes to some of their perimeter players and defensively trying to keep up with a lot of the new upgraded athleticism what a lot of players have. So that's the reason why I have them in the middle compared to a lot of other teams. But also, to be completely clear with you, if the 2010 team continues to grow and mature, they'll probably be better later on down the road. But as of right now, I do have the 50s and 60s a tad bit above the 2010 team. Now, coming in at number 3, it is the 80s. To be completely honest with people, this right here was extremely hard to decide because the last 3 decades or generations, it's pretty close. I cannot lie to you guys. It's really close. It's hard to really make a distinction between the 3, but I think I made some qualifications that make the other 2 decades a tad bit better than the 80s, and here's why. First and foremost, when it comes to the 80s, they have some of the greatest players of all time playing in that generation. Magic Johnson, Isaiah Thomas, Dominique Wilkins, Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and the list goes on and on about how great these players are. Matter of fact, there are some underrated players in that generation or in that decade team, such as Sidney Moncrief, Alex English, and Adrian Dantley, that would still be able to hold their own and stand out if they were ever to go up against any other decade. But the biggest distinction that I was able to make are two things. The first big problem is the center position. Now, unfortunately, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was more dominant and played more dominant years in the 70s. That's the reason why he's representing that decade. And when it comes into the 80s, the two players that come to mind when it comes to big man was either Moses Malone or Robert Parrish. Both of those players are great. Both of those players are probably top 10, top 15 in center position. But when it comes to how dominant they're going to be able to be against other great big men such as Shaquille O'Neal, Tim Duncan, Hakeem Olajuwan, I don't really know where they stand and how favorable they are against those big men. And you could probably make a huge argument that those players are better than Moses Malone and Robert Parrish. On top of that, there's a huge height advantage or disadvantage when it comes to Moses Malone against other bigs, so that also will not, weigh in their favor. On top of that, Moses Malone really wasn't the best interior defender. But the other thing that really stands out about these players in the 80s is that their advantages that they had in their decade and their generation really and truly don't stand the test of time anymore. Magic Johnson is a great example of that, where in the 80s he was a revolutionized player where he was a 6'9" point guard that was able to facilitate and still run point very well, even though he was 6'9", which is the height of a forward. Moving on past that, in the 2000s and the 90s, you have players such as Scottie, Pippen, and LeBron James who would fairly easily match up with Magic Johnson. So again, that advantage that Magic had isn't really there no more. On top of that, you can say the same thing about a player such as Larry Bird and Dominique Wilkins. Even though their athleticism and their skill set was able to push them over the top, I don't really know if they still have that advantages against all-time greats in the last 2 decades that I'm referring to. But with all that being said, you still have great talent in the 80s, so it's still a toss-up in my opinion. You still have a great player such as Isaiah Thomas, who is by far one of the more well-rounded players all time. A point guard that can play offense and defense, can facilitate but still carry the scoring load as well. By far one of the most underrated and well-rounded players of all time. And the list goes on and on. You have Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, a lot of players that played for the Celtics and the Lakers in the 80s will probably make this team as well. And so it's all around great play, but I would still put them third. Now, just like the last selection, this right here was for sure a toss-up, but simply put, it's kind of hard to vote against Michael Jordan. It really is. But the 2000s, I will give them this. They are by far the most deepest, talented decade I think I've seen when I was going back and doing my historical studies with all the decades. There are certain players that might not make the quote-unquote decade team, such as Vince Carter, Tracy McGrady, Dwayne Wade, that would easily make the team on any other decade. But again, we all know some of these players: Kevin Garnett, Dirk Nowitzki, Tim Duncan, Yao Ming, Steve Nash, Jason Kidd, and of course the Black Mamba himself, Kobe Bryant, certain other players, Ray Allen, Allen Iverson. The list goes on and on with the talented and the level of greatness that played in the 2000s. But again, there are certain aspects that they are a tad bit weak in. By far, if Steve Nash was the first or second best point guard within his generation, then he for sure would be a defensive liability. Also, on top of that, when it comes to small forward, besides LeBron, the backup, rather it's Paul Pierce or Carmelo Anthony, again, defensively might end up being a problem when you're talking about guarding other all-time greats in the 90s. But it's very close, to be completely honest with people. Even Yao Ming is a big that probably people tend to forget about, but it's by far a very, very close call when it comes to the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, and it comes even closer when you talk about the 90s and the 2000s. So again, a great generation, a great decade, but they do come in second. And finally, the best generation, the best decade, in my opinion, would have to be the 90s. The talent that they're able to put on display is by far more superior than most other generations, and it's just a tad bit more better than the 80s and the 2000s. I mean, of course, Michael Air Jordan just by himself in his greatness should immediately put them in position to be one of the greatest generations of all time. But of course, you have players such as John Stockton, Hakeem Olajuwan. I would put Shaquille O'Neal in the 90s because his 7 years in the 90s were better, statistically speaking, than his years in the 2000s. Yes, I understand the 2000s. He did win his MVP. He did win his championships. But if you look at the sheer numbers that he put in the 90s, it's ridiculous. Also, you have power forwards such as Dennis Rodman, Charles Barkley, Karl Malone. The list goes on and on with great players, Scottie Pippen as well. And the depth with these players and how well-rounded they are is ridiculous. Also, you have certain players that are fairly underrated, such as Gary Payton. I think a lot of people don't thoroughly understand how great Gary Payton was as a player. He was a great scorer and a defender, and he was still a solid facilitator. So other players that probably don't get as much shine as they probably should, Gary Payton, Patrick Ewing, the list goes on and on. David Robinson is another great one. That probably wouldn't even make the team, but they still stand out as great players in the 90s. So that's the reason why I end up choosing them. And again, like I said before, Michael Jordan. I mean, that should be enough in and of itself, Michael Jordan, man. So with all that being said, that is the list. That's who I think will win the whole generation or decade battle. Please let me know in the comment section below, who do you think I missed out? Who do you think I overrated or underrated? Who do you have winning the whole battle and the shebang? Please let me know in the comment section below. Also, go in the description. You will be able to find the link to the poll where you can vote and have your voice heard about your decision and your idea about which team has the best team and which decade is the best. Also, please share the video. I actually do want to see if other YouTubers wouldn't mind doing this, trying to figure out where exactly they view as some of the best generation or some of the best decade and the best talent that we've seen in the NBA. And maybe, you know, my opinion may be a tad bit more skewed, but I want to hear a lot of people's ideas and their decisions on this topic. So please share the video, tell your favorite YouTuber to watch the video and let them, you know, get an understanding, an idea of what I'm doing, and maybe they'll make a video themselves about it. But I'll see y'all next time. Peace.